Hello again, this is Chris, MTGO's Rex Start, and I'm back for another episode in my ongoing video series on the popular archetypes used in the Tribal Legacy Wars format as they have been played in the Tribal Apocalypse Player Run event. And this week we are covering control decks, and as you can tell from the deck that I've loaded up here, this is a classic control deck as it was played in the extended format. In Grand Prix Los Angeles by Antoine Ruel. He finished first place of this deck back in 2005. And this is one of the better known control decks in the history of Magic. And I start with this as a way of explaining why control decks are extremely difficult to build and pilot in the Tribal Wars format. More than any other deck, they suffer extremely from the requirement to play 20 creatures in your deck. The classic Psychotog deck, in fact, only played 5. There were Madness variants and other things like that that were more aggro control, but the pure control version of Psychotog generally only played 4 Psychotogs and a single Wonder. And the entire build of the deck and style of playing the deck is not really conducive to anything you can do in Legacy Tribal Wars. And as you can see here, this deck was very much focused on card filtering, cantrips, counter spells, bounce, and it can use a lot of one-for-one trading, such as counterspell, primarily because it has card advantage engines such as deep analysis, fact or fiction. And one of the things over the last few months that I've had debates in the comments section for Kuma's articles has been why counterspell does not seem to be played very often in the Legacy Tribal Wars format. And there are a number of explanations for it and reasons that have been offered. I think one of the things that probably makes it hardest, and one of the reasons you don't see a lot of counter magic in the control decks in the format, is that the only way you can profitably play a control deck using these one-for-one trading like countering a creature is that these decks have a lot of card advantage engines in them that allow them to do that, whereas in Legacy Tribal Wars you just don't have the number of support slots to support card advantage, and as a consequence you're not being able to get ahead of your opponent with these one-for-one trading, spot removal, and counter spells. You have to find some other way to do that to get ahead of the opponent, and there's sort of a confluence of that factor plus the fact that the primary thing you're trying to control in the Legacy Tribal Wars format is your opponent's creatures has led instead to the main card advantage engine being board sweepers as opposed to card drawing spells. And so rather than try to draw cards and trade one-for-one of your opponent until eventually you can drop some finisher and just win with it, the control decks in the Legacy Tribal Wars format have tended to be built around the idea of using these board sweepers to get the card advantage against your opponent instead, along with a little bit of spot removal in order to soften the opponent up, maybe make him have to overcommit into one of your sweepers, and so they've developed along completely different axes. But again, it's these classic control decks like this with their limited creatures. Some of the things that they have access to are things that you do want in the Legacy Tribal Wars format, I believe, and one of the ways that you have to build around that when you're creating a deck for Tribal Wars is to try to get some of the spell-like effects, whether it is card advantage, counterspell, card filtering, things of that nature. You have to get some of those spell-like effects from your creature base, is really the best way to go about it. To make up for the fact that you have to play the 20 creatures. So we're going to take a look at a couple of popular successful control decks that were played in the Tribal Apocalypse Player Run event. And we're going to start with probably one of the more classic approaches, the time-tested approach here, which is exemplified with this Angel deck that AJ MP finished first with in September 10th, 2011. This is in Tribal Apocalypse 36, and this is a very classic style for him. And I know Paul, who's Winterwolf on MTGO, has noted AJ's proclivity to just jam a deck full of sweepers, and really, Wrath of God is a card that just ends up winning games. I mean, people just don't play around it. They run smack dab into it and just die. And whether that's because of the way people tend to play in this event, whether they could play around it, or whether they're not constructing their deck to adapt to sweepers, I don't know. But it's been a time tested, over the years to just jam a bunch of sweepers into a deck. And what you see here with AJ's deck is a control deck that is focused entirely on the combat step. If you're not trying to win through the combat step, then AJ's deck isn't going to do anything to control what your plan is. But if you are trying to win through the combat step, and the presumption here is that probably 80 to 90% of the decks in the field on a given week are trying to win through the combat step. AJ's deck is designed simply to prey on those decks. He has Swords to Plowshares for some early spot removal. He's got Wrath of God as a board sweeper. He also has Sunblast Angel, which is when we were talking about using your creature base to get some of your spell-like effects. You get a sort of Wrath of God stapled to an angel here with Sunblast Angel, again as a way to make up for the fact that you're having to play considerably more creatures than any control deck in the history of Magic probably would have played. He also has Blinding Angel, which is allowing him to prevent the opponent from getting to attack you if the angel gets in for damage. He's got Gideon Jura, which allows him to escape any damage from incoming creatures, as well as pick off creatures with the -2, and of course combos very nicely with the Sunblast Angel in that you get all their creatures to be tapped and you can follow it up with Sunblast. And as a nice top-end control finisher, he has Chroma Angel of Wrath here, which with First Strike, Vigilance, Trample, Haste, Protection from Black and Red, and Flying. One of my favorite creatures of all time. Chroma comes in here and closes out the game relatively quickly, which is what you want from a control finisher. Some odder choice here with the Indomitable Archangels, and he had a version of this deck that he played a few months earlier that was less successful, although it was very similar, a few different card choices, that ran Linvala at the 4 spot, which I like an awful lot better because it gives him a little bit more game against some combo decks as well as against combo elves. And Indomitable Archangel really isn't doing anything in this deck other than being a 4/4 flyer for 4, which at the time it was printed was probably fine, but I think we'd probably have better angels at the 4 slot just that have been printed in the last year and a half that you would probably play instead of this, even if you weren't going to run Linvala in that spot. But I think that Linvala gives you some game against other archetypes other than just trying to stop the combat step. And if I were to run a deck of this style, I think I would probably run Linvala in this slot here. Maria Angel, he's not doing anything particularly tricky to make use of her. He's not even running a lot of fetch lands or anything like that, but it does help to be able to make some bird tokens just for chump blockers, things along that nature. Again, his deck here is entirely focused on trying to shut down the aggro opponent and even the mid-range opponent, making sure that if your plan is to win through the combat step, AJ's deck's going to handle you. And he's played a number of different decks, both white decks and black decks, that use this same general formula of board control, sweepers as his sort of form of card advantage in order to shut down that enormous percentage of the deck metagame every week that is trying that angle. So this is a very classic example, tried and true. You can't really go wrong with this style of control deck. Again, not very much game against combo decks that aren't interested in winning through the combat step, but a very good game against most of the field on a given week. And he finished first place of this list and has had a lot of success with decks of this style over the past couple of years and dating back to the pre-Blippy era. So now I'll take a look at a very different sort of control deck here. This is a Stacks deck, and this was piloted first place by A&M1 on April 23rd of 2011 in Tribal Apocalypse 16. And some of these cards you may not be familiar with if you haven't played in the older days or if you haven't played Legacy. Smokestack If you want to take a look at that card, it's rather slow, although he's got a lot of mana acceleration here to get it out. But what that does basically once it comes out is it's sort of an abyss. Makes your opponent sacrifice a permanent each turn. Of course, you have to sacrifice a permanent each turn as well, but you'll design your deck to build around that symmetry in various ways, and A&M has done a little bit of that here. So in part, this is a smokestack deck. In another part, this is a taxing deck. He's got Sphere of Resistance. He also has Lodestone Golem. And in another part, this is a Chalice Tomb deck. He has Ancient Tomb, City of Traders, and Mox Diamonds, giving him a number of ways to get out of turn 1 Chalice. Chalice is extremely good as a control card the more focused the metagame is. If you're up against a lot of decks on a regular basis that are very well tuned, very hyper efficient. Think of the decks that Ranth and Romulus have played a lot this year. These aggro and aggro control decks that are very, very focused on the powerful cards at the 1 and 2 converted mana cost slot. Those are the kind of decks that have a lot of problems with Chalice of the Void. And so it's the kind of card that when you bring it to the table, you're going to want to bring it against a field that you expect to have very streamlined, powerful decks, because it's at its best against those decks. But an opening turn of Ancient Tomb, City of Traders, whatever, into Chalice of the Void for 1 is a very strong line. The most powerful spells in the format probably are Lightning Bolt, Swords to Plowshares, Brainstorm on a week-to-week basis, sort of the pillars of the format in a certain way, and Chalice shuts all of those down. And now he's also incorporated a 12-post engine in here to try to power out some of his more expensive golems, and these golems, as we were talking earlier, fulfill some of the roles, take the principle that your creatures need to do some of the work that spells and artifacts might otherwise do in a more standard control deck. So, for instance, the Lodestone Golem takes some of the taxing duty here. The Brass Herald takes the card advantage responsibility. Sundering Titan takes the mana control responsibility. He has the Crucible of Worlds Wasteland combo in here as well, as a way to wear out an opponent. Much like the Chalice of the Void, Crucible of Worlds Wasteland going to be very good if you're expecting to play against people with normal legacy mana bases. If you're going up against monocolored decks or people using budget mana bases of mostly basics, that's not going to be that good. So you're counting when you bring this kind of thing that you're going to be able to make it to the top tables at the event where you're expecting to see those cards. Precursor Golem, an interesting choice here, also helps him break the symmetry with Smokestack a little bit, in that Precursor Golem brings out a couple of extra guys which you can sack to the Smokestack. And in general, this kind of deck is controlling in a way that is probably not as effective against, it depends what the aggro deck is. It would certainly be very good against something like Cats. It may not be as fast, depending on what kind of draw it gets, to be as effective against just the pure aggro decks as something like AJ's is. And AJ's is probably more reliable against those kind of decks. But this deck has game against a number of different archetypes. Chalice, apart from just shutting down utility spells and, say, one-drop aggro opponent, Chalice can also shut off a combo opponent if you're able to cast the Chalice for the CMC of whatever the combo piece is. So it's a more versatile approach to control. And in general, there haven't been a lot of successful control decks in the Legacy Tribal Wars format, and very few that have gone off of the sort of board sweeper path. And this is one of the very few. I found it extremely interesting to take a look at a different way to go after control in this format. And with that, I'm going to wrap up Control, and I will go on next week. We're almost done with the series here. We have a few random combo archetypes still left to take a look at, but we've hit most of the major archetypes in Magic and in the Legacy Tribal Wars format over these past 7 weeks. And I thank you for joining me this week, and I'll see you again next week.